you know, because I'd be out there watching. I watched everything. I learned how to read train orders, so I knew when there was a special train coming through.
George McKinney, a young boy living in the Midwest when World War II commenced. Growing up in the heart of the nation gave George the opportunity to witness almost every aspect of how the Great War affected the United States. A train station is where he would spend most of his childhood, helping his father with the cafe or simply watching trains, troops, and civilians travel through the small town depot.
All these guys would come through and they'd have 8th Air Force, the symbol, and I can see that in my sleep.
Growing up at the depot meant George was surrounded by war. He learned just how important railways were to the war effort by watching his father work every day.
My dad worked down at the depot, and he was responsible for feeding a restaurant in a separate building beside the depot in the southwestern corner of Minnesota.
George grew up in the small town of Worthington, Minnesota, a town that experienced the many benefits of having a railroad depot. The train depot provided the townspeople with secure jobs throughout the war.
I was just a little boy, in third grade, which would make me, 8, 9 years old. But I knew what was going on, and I was afraid of my dad's being drafted into the Army.
Although George feared that his father would be drafted into the war, he was relieved to learn that his dad's job working at the rail station was essential to the war front effort.
Railroads and farmers and certain jobs were called essential, and they had to be there to work because they knew their jobs and who could replace them. So after that, I settled in to be comfortable that my dad wasn't going to go to war.
Frozen jobs during the war meant that workers were unable to receive raises or take days off throughout the duration of the war. George's father's job at the Worthington Depot Cafe was considered frozen.
This job entailed 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. There had to be somebody in the depot working, and there was never any holidays. My dad never had a day off.
George's father worked day in and day out at the depot in order to support his family. He prepared meals for hundreds of soldiers every day.
And the troops would come every day. They had to be fed. The trains had to be switched. When you had to work, you had to work. I knew when a special train would be coming through, and I would round up my buddies and wonder if it was going to be a POW train, a prisoner of war train. And so we'd get all of my buddies, and we'd sit there on the platform in the depot and wait. And the German POW trains would come through. There's no big deal. There was a guard, and the guards would get out and have a cigarette and just, talk to us and so on and so forth. But every once in a blue moon, a Japanese POW train would come through. And that was different. The Japanese were our hated enemy at that time.
Prisoner of war trains were a rare sight to see in the Midwest, especially Japanese POW trains. These trains looked very different than the usual troop trains that would pass through the depot.
They had bars over the windows. And the windows were open, but they had welded bars, crossbars, so nobody could get out. And the windows were never closed because, well, let's face it, the open window was the air conditioning. And we'd be fascinated when it was a troop train because we'd walk down the train and look at the guards, and there'd be a guard on each end, and there would be guards that step off the train when the train would stop, and they'd walk along the coaches and so on, and we'd be fascinated because they were Japanese. They were different than we were.
In the United States, at the end of World War II, there were over 425,000 prisoners of war located in camps all over the U.S. Prisoner of war camps were much closer to home than George had expected.
And there was a German POW camp about 25 miles south of us. And these trains would stop there and let off these POWs, and they'd take them to this camp and they'd become workers in the farms.
As the wartime labor shortage intensified across rural America, farmers turned to an unexpected source for replacement farm hands: captured German prisoners of war.
And they'd find out which POWs were farmers, and they would work for the farmers around there. And the POWs wanted to go on the farm and work because they would get a good meal at noon, not, camp food. And so they enjoyed that.
George grew up in a time very different than the times we live in now. The Great Depression had just taken the world by storm. Almost everyone in the United States was affected by this extreme economic crisis. Everyone had their own struggles they were forced to overcome.
The war affected me as we didn't have all of the nice things that my kids did growing up.
Growing up during the onset of World War II meant sacrifices for all. The government found it necessary to ration food, gas, and even clothing. Americans were forced to conserve everything during the wartime effort. With not a single person unaffected by the Great War, rationing meant sacrifices for all.
And you got 4 gallons of gas a week for your car. There was no rubber tires. From the time I was in 3rd grade, I knew how to change a tire, patch my bicycle, the inner tube, and patch the tire and put it back on, because you could not buy, beg, or steal a car's tire or a bicycle tire.
Americans were encouraged to help the war effort by participating in scrap metal and paper drives. Building tanks, ships, planes, and weapons required massive amounts of metal. Americans were urged to turn in scrap metal for recycling. Schools and community groups across the country held scrap metal drives.
And I was in the Scouts, so we'd go around and people would leave metal at their curbs, and we'd go around with pickup trucks and we'd pick up metal or paper or tin cans or things like that. And we all had to throw our toys in there too, because they were made out of metal. Help the war effort, that was the big propaganda thing.
Living in a small town during World War II, George had many memorable experiences. One of the most prominent experiences throughout his childhood was witnessing a B-17 land near his hometown of Worthington, Minnesota.
I was down at the railroad station, and it was a Sunday, and it was right at, the war had maybe been going not even a year yet, and a big B-17 come through. And he was flying around the city, and geez, for a kid like me to see one of those big B-17s that we heard about and so on, and he was circling, and then finally I ran in and got my dad, and I said, he's going to land, he's got his wheels down. So he came in, and so my dad, I made him go out to the airport, and we couldn't go near the plane, they had guards around it. He had some kind of an emergency and landed there. So the commander of the aircraft, they had a mechanical problem, and but they needed food, so my dad got him in the car and took him down to the depot and to sign some paperwork, and my dad was going to prepare some food, and we were going to take out to feed these guys. And in the meantime, this plane was based down in Sioux City, Iowa, and they were sending a bus or something up and some mechanics to fix the plane. But anyway, then my dad and another guy took some, sandwiches and coffee and whatever out so that the crew could eat. And I remember the captain or the lieutenant, whoever was in charge of the aircraft, riding in the plane, or from the plane down in the car to the depot and to the cafe. And I said, "Is there real bullets in that gun?" And I remember that. He says, "I can't tell you." I'm sure there were not, because they were on a training mission. But that was fascinating to me. That's one of the big things I do remember, a great big B-17 in my hometown.
Children that grew up during World War II had to learn how to respond to air raids. Schools conducted air raid drills to make sure that children were prepared for the worst. There were also strict rules that children had to follow if the air raid sirens were heard. Once the sirens had sounded, parents weren't allowed to collect their children from school, and if children were in school, they had to stay there until the all clear was given. Blackouts were also practiced throughout the war. Blackouts were used to minimize as much outdoor light as possible, in case enemies were to attack at night. People were encouraged to cover their windows and doors at night with heavy curtains, cardboards, or paint.
we had air raid practice. We had an air raid warden in our town would practice blackouts during the war. And we had on top of the tallest building in town, there was a lookout post up there. And about twice a year, we'd have an air raid drill. And our neighbor of ours was an air raid warden, and he'd come around and he had a band on his arm. I can't remember what it said, but he had a helmet on, and we had to cover up our windows with black screens or black screening, or turn out the lights for a period. And the fire whistle would blow to after 15 minutes, and that's one thing that affected me that really remembered.
In 1945, World War II ended. Life could finally go back to normal for not only George and his family, but for the rest of the nation.
My mother died, she cried, and many other ladies did, because the war was over.
The overall feeling after the war was pure elation. Hearing that the war was finally over brought an extreme sense of joy to the entire nation. Some men and women were even in disbelief that the end was actually here.
And I said, the war is over. He says, well, if the war was ended, the whistles would be blowing. And just then the power station whistle started blowing. He ran out across the tracks. There was an engine sitting over there, and he pulls the cord, and the train engine, you know, and he was ringing a bell. Everybody, it was elation. Things were closed for a minimum of 2 days. You couldn't buy nothing.
Many people celebrated by running into the streets. However, George and his friends had a more unique way of celebrating the end of the war.
Some street guy was selling watermelons out of the back of a pickup truck, and I knew where to get ice at the depot. So we had our celebration was a watermelon the next day. We cut up a watermelon, iced watermelon. Of course, August, it was hotter than blazes, so.
Once the excitement of the end of the war was over, life went back to normal. George went on to do many awe-inspiring things. After high school, he worked in Yellowstone National Park as a summer job. George then went back to his roots and continued his appreciation for the railroads by escorting tours for the Union Pacific Railroad out of Chicago. Working on the rails yet again, George remembered his life as a young boy. As a child who grew up during one of the most intense and emotional times in the United States history, George will forever remember his childhood. The time he spent with his father at the Worthington Depot would be cherished for the rest of his life. World War II shaped George into the incredible and honorable human being that he is today. As children, we are taught that in order to survive, we must have strength. However, there is no way to fully comprehend the meaning of strength without observing what it means to truly be strong. Growing up in the midst of one of the most intense and emotional times in the United States history, George McKinney was able to observe what it means to have strength by growing up in the heart of a war-torn nation. Sitting on the platform of the Worthington Depot gave George the opportunity to see the troops pass by with no fear of what the future held. It gave him the chance to watch his father work endlessly at the depot in order to provide for his family. It showed him the mothers who constantly stayed strong and showed no sign of fear for their children. Growing up at the depot provided George with the ultimate ability to understand the meaning of strength. He was able to watch every aspect of the war pump in and out of the train station like a beating heart. As a child growing up during World War II, George McKinney learned the true meaning of strength. I was fortunate enough to be able to get to know George McKinney through the Harlem Veteran Project. Meeting a man as inspiring and kind as George has really changed my perspective on the home front. Through watching his interview and creating this documentary, I have learned so many life lessons. In today's society, it is easy to take things for granted. Hearing about George's childhood experiences made me realize how much times have changed. I consider myself to be extremely lucky to be able to have met this man. He has made such an incredible impact on my life. Thank you, George McKinney, for giving me this amazing opportunity to learn about your remarkable life story.